Where do you think it's easier?
Well, obviously, where there are 100 people.
You're wrong.
Stand up can become a part of the city's economy.
Every comic who performs in Astana gets hardened, in a way, by going through it. Comedy is becoming more concentrated within the country. The main value of a joke is that it works in the moment. With the development of AI, something real is becoming more and more valuable.
Stand up in Kazakhstan is at an interesting point right now. The audience is ready to pay for a comedy night. There are more comics and venues now, but the industry itself is built by hand through connections, constant format experiments, and a clear idea of why a guest should buy a ticket. Today, we'll try to figure out how this scene works from the inside, how stand up makes money, how it builds an audience, and if entertainment in Kazakhstan can be a sustainable business, rather than just a hobby for enthusiasts. Our guest is Arthur Afonso, a stand up comic, producer, and comedy event organizer who was born and raised in Moscow, has been in comedy since 2011, and has worked as a producer and correspondent for federal TV channels. Since 2022, Arthur has lived in Kazakhstan and developed Comedy Point, a comedy community through which he organizes performances by local and international comics. Arthur, hello.
Hello, thank you for the invitation.
The first question I have to ask: how is stand up organized in Kazakhstan today? And is it already a full fledged industry if we look at the market as a whole, right? Or is it still a scene that a few key people are building by hand? What kind of Lego is this?
I'd like to point out right away that Lego is a very good example, because just like Lego, it's all seemingly one company, but at the same time, we have many sets. The same can be said about stand up in Kazakhstan, because it depends on the region, it depends on the city. So if we're talking, say, about Astana or Almaty, that's one story. If we're talking about, I don't know, Petropavlovsk, Pavlodar, or Taraz, that's a different story. In some places, the number of comics, the size of the audience, and overall, well, it just so happens that the level of this industry is a bit higher at this point, right? So, for example, if we're talking about Octao, well, the guys there, even though they've only celebrated, as far as I remember, their second year of existence, HumorCon Actao, I think that's what they're called. The guys took a very smart business-oriented approach to building a stand-up community. So even though there aren't many comics there, they train their own comics in terms of writing new material every week and performing every week. They meet constantly, trying to figure out how to better work with the audience. And that's not even counting all the behind-the-scenes stuff, right? So if we're talking about Almaty, for instance, there are a lot of comics who do it for fun, as strange as that sounds, where people really enjoy telling stories, experimenting. They don't always go on stage with the goal of, I don't know, winning over the audience. Sometimes they just go out to joke around, yeah. So in Astana, most of the comics who perform are people building a career, because you see how bold I've become in my 5th year living in Astana? There are opportunities to build a career. While preparing for our podcast, I refreshed my knowledge and my impressions a bit. And I thought about how in Astana, as an artist, as a comic, it really feels like you can build a career. In the sense that, besides the fact that there are two official comedy projects, Stand Up Astana and Sun Project, there's the Amazing Positive Bar, where young comics can start their careers, experiment, try things out, and so on. There's Comedy Point, through which I also organize various comedy events, including, as you correctly noted, for visiting artists from other cities and countries. There are some local projects, so in this way, there's a full-fledged, though currently underrepresented, industry through which a comic can grow. If he's a beginner, he performs there. If he's more experienced, there. If he's aiming for something more, then there. For instance, often when I talk to Almaty comics, they don't fully understand how to move forward or develop. Though, in my view, the joke defines it, because Almaty is currently home to one of the most important stand-up clubs in the CIS. They usually say in Central Asia, but I'll go further and say in the CIS, because there are really two large halls. Amazing events happen there. It's now the 5th year of Central Asia's largest comedy festival, Alam Comedy Fest, which attracts guests from other countries. So this already shows that we've passed that local stage, right? And even in Astana, a festival was held recently where comics from other cities and countries also came. So we need to talk specifically about what we want.
Let's start with a brief explanation for our viewers and listeners about what the stand up scene actually consists of. Is it comics, venues, organizers, audiences, festivals, or open mics? What exactly is a stand up scene?
Overall, you've listed everything stand up consists of except for one thing: the suffering of writing material. You didn't list that, and you didn't list the process of filming supporting material. For instance, the fact that we're recording a podcast, that can also be considered supporting material. Because, unlike the times of the Soviet Union, say, where our satirists performed their material and due to the small amount of content, in the media environment, the content that was filmed immediately spread as quotes, jokes, and so on. Now we have a lot of content. Consequently, you need to maintain your presence in the media environment. And besides the fact that you have to write jokes to perform on stage, you also, of course, have to create supporting material. That's sketches, podcasts, everything related to that. Right, but if we go back to the original question of what makes up our scene, it's the comics. Yes, of course, it's the comics. And it's important to understand that by comics, we mean people who are involved in comedy in general. These are people who perform on stage. It doesn't matter if they perform for 3 minutes or do hour-long monologues and so on, because if we get into a detailed breakdown right now, an hour and a half wouldn't be enough for us, basically. So these are comics who are trying to tell something. If the audience who's ready to listen spend their time and sometimes money. Why sometimes? Because events aren't always paid, it varies. Also, of course, it's the venues, because not every venue is suitable for stand-up. Because stand-up is a very intimate event. And basically, if you do stand up in a McDonald's, the audience, and the comic will all suffer. I mean, everyone will leave with some kind of emotional trauma. Yeah, why? Go to a stand up show and you'll understand why. Of course, it's the supporting staff, right? So few people know about them, but it's the sound engineer, the manager, the ticket taker, and of course the waiters who serve you, right? Basically, it's in some cases security, photographers, videographers. So that's at least the. And we're not even talking about the ad specialist or the designer who makes the posters. So we have a team pool that works directly with this. Usually, if you're outside the field, you don't know about this team. I mean, these are people who mostly work within their own industry, and they're often comics themselves. That's just how it is. Jokes. Of course, jokes, stories, and overall, probably life. Life is the most important part of stand up because all humor is born from life.
I can't help but notice you came from Moscow, right? How much does Kazakhstan differ from Moscow or Russia in general, where the stand up industry was already established?
Well, look, we have to start here with the classic phrase, Moscow wasn't built in a day, right? And plus, we're comparing it to Moscow, so if you compare it to Russia, basically the answer would be exactly the same as how our podcast started. I mean, it's all local, some places more, some less, right? It's the same here. In Moscow, there are just simply more people. Let's start with that, right? I mean, there is simply more people and more money is being poured into these processes. So now a lot of money is starting to be poured in too, right? I mean, very big artists are starting to come, which is great. Local comics are starting, I mean, comics born in Kazakhstan, building careers in Kazakhstan, they're starting to fill huge venues, and both in Russian and in Kazakh, and even in English. And the same thing is happening here. We've already passed the stage where basically a venue owner would be shocked that, say, 120 people showed up. It's not like that now. Now, all venues more or less know what stand up is, they're ready. But we haven't reached the stage yet where basically comics could earn money so freely that we'd have so many projects like Comics Against Problems, right? Because it's important to note that, like, we know Comics versus Problems, which is basically one version happening in Moscow, but there are many of them. And each one draws an audience, each one makes money, right? I mean, we have Arzan Psychologtar, which is basically a show in Kazakh, and some similar ones, but they're more local, and most of the audience doesn't know about them, but they exist, right? Right. But as for them making as much money as they do in Moscow, for example, not yet. But development is happening.
Mm hmm. Okay. So let's take Astana and Almaty for comparison. Let's get a bit more global.
Right.
Yeah, so the main distinctive feature of the development of that scene and this scene in general. Is there some kind of development paradox visible, or are they going in completely different directions and they don't like mirror each other at all?
Of course they do. Of course they do. Because it's still all part of the same field. There are some common points. For instance, the media presence factor, of the artist, that's a key factor, regardless of which city or even country we're talking about. That's a factor that still, excuse the terminology, plays a role, no question about it, right? Right, but there are certain peculiarities? So, for example, in Almaty, people are more open, even if we're just talking about the audience, right? So, basically, every comedian who comes from Astana to Almaty, well, you can ask any of them, they love it. Simply because in Astana, you really have to earn that reaction, the audience's reaction. In the sense that, like, even when I'm hosting an event, I go over a set of rules so we can all enjoy the event to the fullest. And one of the rules, my personal request that I only say in Astana, is if it's funny, please laugh. I only say that in Astana because people in Astana, it's not that they don't laugh, it's just that they're more reserved. A bit more, an element of being from the north, in my opinion. It's not because people are ungrateful. In my view, generally, people in, say, Astana or Karaganda perceive what's happening with more empathy. They take it to heart in the sense that after the event, they really remember what made them happy. But given that open reaction in the moment is harder for them. So, for example, I was warming up for a comedian and I said that rule. There was Roman Fillon, I think, maybe, I don't remember exactly which comedian. He came, he's performing, and right in front of him sits an audience member with a stone face. The whole event, he's sitting there with a stone face, zero emotion at all. And this comedian who is performing, at the end of the night, he sees that most of the room, well, they're listening to him, but they're not exactly laughing, right? And he's like, man, you guys are a weird crowd. Like, he's upset. He's been doing comedy for so many years, KVN and all that, but it's not working. There. And after the show, he really, excuse my language, got in his head about it, just sitting there upset. Like, how could this happen and all that? I told you so. It's not that you did anything wrong, it's just people here are just a bit more reserved. You have to get them going. And I'm like, "Well, are you ready to go take photos?" He's like, "Does anyone wanna take photos?" I'm like, "Yeah, tons." And he's approached, he's surprised, he's leaving. This guy who was sitting across from it with a stone face approaches him. He walks up, reaches out his hand, and says, I almost pissed myself laughing. Literally, those were his exact words. Yeah. And this, in my opinion, epitomizes what happens, say, specifically in Astana, that people are more closed off. But on the other hand, as I said, and in my view, this is the value of the Astana audience in the sense that if you made them laugh, they'll come up to you in a year or two and say, I remember, you were really great back then. I even told my grandma about it. So there's that aspect. Whereas in Almaty, because there are more impressions, people say they laughed today. They've already forgotten. They've moved on. So you can't really say it's a downside, right? But for a comedian, as for any artist, it's a bit of a sad story, of course, that you didn't leave such a lasting impression, so to speak. In terms of momentum, of course, an artist's career is a bit harder, say, in Istana, through the lens of there simply being fewer performance projects. It feels like there are more in Almaty. Although, then again, I have this one colleague who moved from Almaty to Astana. He also does a podcast, and he was talking about the difficulties he had in Almaty regarding the number of gigs. So it might be a subjective factor too? But it's simply clear that there are more audience members, just more people, and as a result, you can potentially perform more often, obviously.
Would it be fair to say that there's a certain feeling that Kazakhstan is developing or has developed, you could say it already has, its own? Now, so much a national, but rather a specifically Kazakhstani style of humor, its own audience and its own rules. Would you agree with that assessment?
I absolutely agree with that assessment because even if we're not talking about Kazakh Shah comedy entirely in the Kazakh language, which is doing its own thing, so to speak, even in Russian, if you listen to comedy, regardless, by the way, I should note, regardless of the city, you'll see a unique character. I'd even say, having been to various festivals, that every city has its own distinct character. It's not just Kazakhstan as a whole, but every city has its own little distinguishing features, and it's not just that one city jokes about this and another about that. That's obvious. It's more about the delivery, about the direction they try to take the material. So there isn't a single unified version. Everyone seems to be searching, which is great. And obviously, as someone coming from the outside, my subjective perception is that there are a lot of references to the internal culture, specifically. But on the other hand, that's something that's happening everywhere right now. I was discussing this with the amazing comedian Sava, and we were talking about how Russia is becoming more insular in terms of information, some kind of distribution for their product. So we're not saying it's bad or good, it's just a certain fact, right? And because of that, say in other countries, we know less about what's happening, what's being released in Russia right now. We don't know about some of those small local products. Not because they're bad or good, it's just that the internet's more local now. Yeah. So, like, what's happening in Kazakhstan? I know more about what's going on there. Which projects? From Russia, I only see some of the major projects. And what does that lead to? To the fact that comedy is becoming more concentrated within the country.
Mhm.
Right. Some internal stars emerging now in Kazakhstan, well, it's hard to say they're provincial, right? Like, for example, there's Ansagan, who's, well, an amazing comic. Well, obviously there's Ruslan Tai, Telegin. I mean, amazing. And why is it amazing? Not only do they do their own kind of comedy, not only are they good comics, that's another matter. These guys write jokes in 3 languages, they perform in 3 languages. Do you realize how difficult that is? And so, at the same time, they're conveying their own thoughts, their own meanings that, say, a comic from, I don't know, Omsk, for instance, wouldn't have written. Not because he's bad, it's just he's surrounded by different realities and he jokes about different things. He thinks differently, he delivers it differently,
Well, and society everywhere.
and society is different, of course, yes. And so right now, it's as if we have this boom of internal comedy, of internal meanings. And in general, it's logical because a stand up comic, it's important to remember that even though the word comic is there, there are essentially many opinion leaders. Every comic, they bring a perspective to a specific audience. Right. And so for a stand up comic, in my subjective view, it's a bit harder to be a universal comic for everyone. A bit harder?
Summarizing, you could say the first block, I have one more clarifying question. What do you think the scene needs most right now? More comics, more of an audience, more performance venues, more producers, or more media? What does the industry need right now, like never before, in your opinion?
Can I have everything? Well, like, no. Well, if we're being serious about it, of course, the question is specifically what's needed more. But it's hard to answer. I mean, maybe it's hard for me to answer because it's different for different cities. I mean, like, for example, I was talking to the guys from Petropavlovsk, right? So they don't need media exposure as much as they need more comics. Active ones who don't just, say, perform one time and then lose interest afterwards, for instance, right? Another project, they have enough comics. On the contrary, they need media exposure to financially prove that it's all worthwhile in terms of the work they do. So here, of course, you have to see who needs what more. Because, like, the community has many viewers, but the community isn't ready for it. Well, they're not ready to write the kind of material that would make these viewers come back a second time, right? And on the flip side, you'll have plenty of comics, but they lack, I don't know, the media presence needed to promote the show. So just keep moving forward however you can. That's my advice. Let's just say life gave us apples, so let's make some kind of cider out of them.
When someone buys a ticket to a stand up show, they're supposedly paying for jokes. Well, in theory at least.
Yeah, ideally. Right.
But in reality, they're paying for the evening, the atmosphere, the live presence, the emotion. It's essentially an attention economy. It's a rational use of time.
Yes.
So, why is it that in 2026, people are so willing to pay for live stand up when they already have endless free content on their phones?
Look, there's a very simple way to look at it. Why do people go to the zoo?
Why?
We could, theoretically, watch National Geographic and see how tigers run so gracefully there. But still, if a zoo comes to town, people are gonna go. Because, as you correctly noted, being there in person is important and valuable. Even just the other day, there was a big open air festival. I won't give them free advertising, but the point is, anyway, any open air event, let's call it that, right? And why do people go there, even though they've heard those songs, those tracks, countless times, and they pay, say, 64,000 tenge to be exact?
That's why.
Yeah. Why? Because it's live communication with the artist. Because he makes mistakes in the moment. He has these little unscripted movements. He's real in that moment. Because right now, we're living in the reality of this, if you'll excuse the expression, refined world, where, especially with the rise of AI, everything authentic becomes increasingly valuable. And stand up is one of the most authentic performance genres, truly real. Because theoretically, even a song, with all due respect to musicians and artists, they're amazing. I have a lot of friends who are musicians and so on, but no stand up comic can write, say, a best of, I don't know, an hour of their best material and then spend the next 50 years performing it, touring with it, and telling the same jokes. It just won't work for you. I'm sorry. You're obligated to keep writing, even if you're, I don't know, a very seasoned comic. If life somehow allows you not to constantly rewrite your material, you still can't tell the same jokes for 10 years, because the thing about comedy is that you'll lose the spark in that material yourself.
What if you tour like Petrosan just because people have already forgotten the material? He traveled the whole world and then came back for another round.
Tell me, please, were you at Petrosian's most recent concert?
No, not.
Just look, first of all, Petrascan, I was at his previous show. For context, Victor Petrascan is a Romanian comedian who's been touring the planet for 6 years now. And, I mean, he's not exactly welcome in some cities, so to speak, but he shows up anyway. Right, and he packs the shows. And his shows are in English. Yeah. I mean, I even remember he had a show in Shymkent. For context, about Victor. I sorta remember his previous show where he told a lot of jokes that were based on what's happening in the world. Right. So, like, he's on tour, he sees a news story like, I don't know, otters became the number one animal in the city. And that's it. He starts riffing on that topic. So, like, next year, it won't be otters at number one anymore. And so he's already writing jokes about something else. Plus, he does two shows. The first is the solo stand up set, the second is fully improvised where he talks to the audience. So he doesn't repeat himself there either. When he finds the time to do all this is a mystery, I'm telling ya. Because Victor, besides being a great comic, he also organizes everything himself. Can you imagine? He makes the posters, he films everything, he runs the ads, he even scans the tickets. I mean, if it were up to him, he'd probably do his own sound too. But he's the kind of person who, as much as possible, keeps everything under his own control. And I asked him, so how do you even live? Because all this, it seems like it's easy. It seems like it's all easy. But it takes time and energy. And given the reality of being on tour for 6 years, it's hard. Just try going to three cities in a row in three different countries. You'll be exhausted. You'll have a great time, but you'll be tired. Now imagine being on the move like that for 6 years. Oh, so that's why a comic is someone who's in constant work mode.
But still, if I understand your logic correctly, not everyone is meant to write a symphony that will last for centuries. But nevertheless, the possibility and the probability of that exists, right?
It reminds me of that amazing experiment with the chimpanzees.
That's a bit much.
Oh, it's a very accurate example. If we're gonna talk like this in these kinds of terms, then of course. I'm black, I can say that. Anyway, so any monkey can write a symphony, it's true. But stand up, in my opinion, is as close as it gets to that, and I'm not even joking. Because anyone can get up on a stand up stage. Literally anyone. I mean, sometimes people tell me that not everyone can be funny. I don't think that's true.
So, whether it's Tamara from the school cafeteria, for example, or let's say Ingrid from the train, she can absolutely come over and try her hand at it whenever she wants to.
I'll tell you more. I actually know some tomorrows right now who perform quite well, and sometimes even win money at open mics and so on. Right. I truly believe that anyone can perform comedy. Truly anyone. Just like, excuse me, anyone can perform music. Maybe someone here will, pardon the expression, hate on me, but I think anyone can. The question is the level at which you'll perform. That's true. Yeah, because, well, really, there are people with an amazing innate comedic talent, and if they also have discipline and enough time, well, with the wind at their back, they can achieve amazing results. Yes. But on the other hand, there are people who have nothing, and they still succeed. You know? And there are people who have everything and they don't succeed. So here, there are many such elements, ups and downs, just like I think in life, right?
Um, if you think about the extreme again of stand up, well, as clickbaity as this question might sound, what does a live audience give that YouTube, TikTok, and all those reels on the internet can't?
A live test, of course.
Like that?
Of course, a live test. Absolutely. I mean, for example, I have a wonderful friend who works in television, and when he wanted to launch a comedy project, the executive producer told him, "We won't let you launch a comedy project until you perform stand up." Literally. Because you can run as many tests as you want through Telegram, start your own group there and post jokes. You can record as many reels, shorts, and so on as you like, and think it's okay, but the live test is on stage. It's how to put it, as objective as possible. Completely, even though all of it is subjective. Comedy is subjective. How you performed, the audience's perception, it's all subjective. But if through all this subjectivity, you can still make people laugh, you will develop this, as strange as it sounds, seed, thanks to which you'll be able to, let's use the word extrapolate it to any of your activities. You'll understand everywhere that this will likely work, that probably won't work, and so on. Plus, of course, you gain huge experience working with an audience, regardless of whether you're pitching your product or just giving a toast at your mother-in-law's anniversary, this skill will come in handy.
Speaking of progression, how realistic is it now to hold an audience's attention? Say you've gathered an audience of 1,000 people, and you've gathered an audience of, say, 100 people. It's logical to see where it'll be simpler or easier, but still, over your 5 years here, you can see the difference.
Well, let me ask you now. You said it's logical where it's easier. Where do you think it's easier?
Well, where there are 100 people, of course.
You're wrong.
But what about the attention factor?
That's the thing. The fewer people there are, the more they get distracted.
Uh-huh.
Right. So basically, if you have a room of 20 people, you have to keep all 20 of them focused. You need to engage with everyone. You see that, say, person 19 has started, I don't know, talking to person 16. And you have to address that. Otherwise, it'll snowball and you'll lose the whole room. The larger the audience, the more you get what we call contagious laughter in comedy. They're more in sync. It's easier to work the crowd. So basically, any comic who's performed for 500 or 1,000 people will tell you that in a room like that, you drop a joke and it just ripples through the crowd like an avalanche. Right. So even the way you write jokes changes, in the sense that the smaller the room, the more you need short jokes that land quickly and get an immediate reaction. But the bigger the room, the more you have to pause between the jokes. Yeah, and it's not just here, it's pretty much the same everywhere.
Speaking of the creative industry, to continue our conversation, it always seems so free and romantic, almost like a fairy tale in a way, right? To the average person who's just seen some stand up online, they think they can just go anywhere and get that same result. But if a project is going to last more than one night, you can't escape the financial side of it, right?
Mhm.
I mean, it has to be a business venture. Tickets, rent, promotion, the performers. At what point does stand up become a business?
I think the seeds are sown the moment you, as an organizer, start doing several shows in a row. That's when your reputation starts to come into play. At that point, you start calculating budgets because, well, you have to report to the tax office. Oh, excuse me. You have to pay the comics a little something, pay the sound engineer. You need to budget for advertising the next event, and that's when the whole system starts to take shape. Usually, the comic who's actually performing doesn't think about any of that. And generally, that's how it should be, because very few comics can be organizers at the same time, and vice versa. It's very hard for an organizer to also be a comic. Because as ironic as it sounds, they're two completely different paths. Because the organizer, he's thinking about all these details, and even during a joke, he's like, "Okay, so we're performing now, this is all funny, but our timing is an hour 23, and it's been an hour 19, so that means." And it's hard to relax on stage when you're focused on all that. A comic, on the other hand, needs to be in the flow. So even in those tiny moments, you kinda have to choose at some point, it's hard to maintain that balance. But the irony is that a comic struggles without organizers, and an organizer struggles to put on stand-up if they aren't a comic themselves.
Yeah.
So there's a huge difference. There's an ironic connection here
Like what?
in the sense that if you're a comedy event organizer, if you're not doing shows for someone like Nurlan Saburov and so on, you have to love this whole thing. You have to basically want to perform yourself and so on, and only then can you really organize things.
So, a person needs to have a certain creative intuition to understand how it works.
Be in the scene.
At the very least, just paying money to make it work, that's not how it goes. So, it's not about just pouring money into this project and wanting people to come and enjoy stand up, but it turns out if I don't have that, I'll pour money in and I'll lose it, right? That's already about the idea of it being a quick effect of fast money.
Yeah, let me just say right way. It's like, kids don't smoke. It's the same thing. Kids don't pour money into stand up if you haven't thought it through, haven't calculated everything. That's very important. So basically, if some young guy comes to you saying, "Give me 1 million, I'll set up a bunch of open mics for you," walk away from that person. I'm telling you right now. I mean, stand up is graded into a huge number of formats. And through some formats, if we're talking about your hypothetical investment, you can make money. It's true because, for example, we bring in an artist, a musician, right? And the sponsor is the person who pays the artist's fee, pays for some technical writers, and so on. And we have it written in the contract that he gets a certain margin, right? And so he gets his money, yeah. And in the case of a big concert by some artist and so on, including a comedian, it works. But in the case of an open mic, it's not worth it for you. In terms of opening, I don't know, a stand up bar, I was just discussing this with a girl recently. She comes up to me and says, "Arthur, I have money. I want to open a stand up bar." And I'm like, "Don't do it." Right. Because I gave her a long hour-and-a-half lecture on why she shouldn't. See, because it's one thing if you really, well, if you love it, say you're a comic, you're the head of a large comedy community where you have, well, at least 20 comics, then in that sense, it makes sense. But if not, you have to gather comics, you have to gather an audience, you have to plan so that events don't repeat, so that the audience wants to come. You have to work on the internal operations of the bar, including literally the bar's kitchen. So it's a huge amount of work, and if you really love stand-up, good luck. But for example, we have this amazing example of Archer Shemgunov from Kazan, an amazing comedian. He opened a stand-up bar, we were chatting once, and he says, "The bar makes money, it brings in cash and all that, but just so you understand, it brought in enough money for us to do a great renovation after 2 years." Think about it.
Speaking of this caution, then what's the truth about what the economy of stand up events is really based on?
It depends on what status you're looking at it from. If you're looking at it as, say, an organizer who isn't tied to a location, like me for instance,
Let's say you.
let's say me, then in my case, it's a percentage of tickets sold, basically. But that's, again, we're talking about,
Well, in general terms, again,
you see, it's hard to answer because it depends on what you agree on, right? I mean, there are organizers who get paid in other ways, you know? So I don't want to say it's like that for everyone, but for me specifically, it is. If we're talking about a bar owner, then there are other factors, right? Like some basically earn by getting a percentage of what's sold at the bar, in the kitchen, and so on. Like some of them get a flat fee. Like musicians, for instance, a musician performs at an event, say at 8 o'clock, and has 3 sets. And regardless of the audience size, he gets his fee from the venue. There's that kind of partnership. Right. But as far as I know, most do it through tickets, yeah.
What's harder, coming up with a good show or consistently selling tickets?
Listen, in my opinion, coming up with a good show, in my view, because as they say, all the good ideas are already out there somehow. You can generally sell even a bad show because we basically understand what sells a show, how it all works through the lens of marketing, right? But actually coming up with something new so that it grabs attention, and it's not just some new, like, comics against problems, you still have to come up with that.
What expenses does the audience never see?
All of them.
That many?
Well, okay. Well, which ones? Okay, let's put it this way. It's a bit awkward with you, but in your opinion, what expenses does the audience see?
Well, okay, first of all, advertising.
Let's say, and even then, they don't know how much.
Well, yeah, of course, but they see it, it's visible after all. And then, say, if there's food and stuff, but clearly for the venue, I mean, you have to put in the effort to arrange the place. So, if I go, for example, to an event, I realize that, well, first of all, it's not just some shack, it's, say, a bar, let's assume, right? It has things in it. It has waiters, so that means money's being spent on that. Now, about the comics, I don't know. I mean, there's an understanding that sometimes they get paid and sometimes they don't. There are both options here. So, I mean, that's all I see, for example, most of the time. Of course, undoubtedly, other things might play a role, like what's been mentioned a few times today, but still, that's the most obvious to me.
Well, you see, you've already listed only 3 indicators now, right? So at the same time, basically, you have no idea how often it happens that nearly 1 million is poured into a comic's targeted ads, and still some of the audience says, oh, we didn't know. You have no idea. I'll tell you more. There's this amazing comic, Max Evdokimov. He's a comic from Russia, basically. And he told literally the following joke that my audience is apparently stupid because I post a reel about I have one tomorrow on the 14th, something like that, a concert in Samara. Oh, tomorrow's the concert in Samara, so come on out. And the very first comment, 2 seconds after that reel was, "When's the concert in Samara?" I mean, what can you even say to that? Obviously, everyone's different, but still. So, as a result, not everyone realizes there's a budget involved. Regarding the locations, too, this part really amused me because there's this amazing project called Don't Tell Comedy. Don't Tell Comedy is actually a franchise now, and it's built on the idea that you, as the audience, never know where the event will be. You know it's stand up, you know there'll be comics, but you don't know where. And within the format of this project, the location is always as strange as possible. It could be an abandoned asylum, it could be a police station, basically something unusual. So as a result, you show up and you're like, they must have cheaped out, it's a barn. But no, that's the concept, so here too. You see, it's not entirely obvious. If we're talking about the expenses, of course, the sound engineer, the designer, the host, the targeted ads. If you're not that talented and can't, say, film or edit, then you need an editor, for instance. Right, that's an administrator. If you're lucky, you have volunteers. If not, you have assistants you might be paying. With the location, it depends on what you negotiate. Maybe it's actually a rental, or maybe not. Maybe the venue's paying you. That's not obvious either. For example, if stand up is popular in your city, you can just create your product. But for instance, I spoke with some town, let's say Petropavlovsk, for example, and they were told, yes, you could do stand up here, but pay 30,000 teng for the sound equipment. Just like that. Will the audience know? No, they won't. Then taxes. We're law abiding people after all, so of course taxes must be paid. So you give a percentage to the ticketing service and a percentage to the tax office. And there you go. You have a nice, fun event. So that's just what comes to mind right now.
I see now. Before this, we were talking to Maxim Zverev, the product manager, and I really liked something he said. I asked, "What do you do if a product isn't selling? What do you tell the client?" We tell the client, "It's a niche." So now I realize you can say, "It's a feature." Why are we doing stand up in a place like this? It's a feature. Aren't you afraid?
Why did they douse you with water and beat you? It's a joke. It's the format.
And what's more important for sales to you personally? The comic's name, the venue, trust in the organizer, or consistency?
We can list them right here in order of importance. In first place, as you correctly noted, is the comedian's name. This is, as I mentioned at the very beginning of evening, the artist's internal media presence, regardless of the country we're in and so on, is a key factor. Next is consistency. Surprisingly, but consistency is a very important factor. If we're not talking about someone like Nerlin Sabura, but about a more local artist, their steady appearances lead to people understanding that, say, on this day I can come, have a laugh, and so on. That's an important factor. Next, we have the venue. The venue is a very important factor because, indeed, some viewers don't go to, say, a bar. I mean, I once did an event for some amazing guys who do comedy with elements of poetry. And they have an older audience. They're not comfortable coming to a bar. They're willing to pay like 10 to 15,000 tang, 20, it doesn't matter how much. But it's important to them that it's like this. In a tailcoat with a spouse, all of that. And it's clear that for the sake of this, you rent some sort of community center, right? So that's why the venue matters. Next, we have, of course, the organizer, who is least important in this specific scenario, because the end viewer doesn't really know about the organizer. I mean, for example, people have started recognizing me now because I'm always out there. But then again, you see, they find out about me right then and there. So it's something like that. But again, consistency plays a role here. If, say, a comedy project regularly posts, I don't know, Astana Turtles, for instance, and they post events every week, and a person's like, oh, I was at Astana Turtles last week, it was cool, I'll go. Then, yes, we put the organizer's name factor first because it's already a brand. It's not a person, it's a brand. Those are different things.
By the way,
Yeah,
a quick question. Is it more convenient to work with a person or a brand?
depends on who you ask. If we're talking about, say, venues, for them, of course, it's much.
No, I mean, for you as an organizer, what's more convenient for you, a brand or a person?
Well, for me as an organizer, of course, it's more comfortable to work with people.
Uh-huh.
Right, but you see, the end user, the end consumer of the product, well, they're not gonna figure out who's who, right? I mean, they see you. And all the comedians on stage as a brand. For example, I mentioned Stand Up Astana earlier. Say the guys are performing. Among the performers, someone comes on who, let's say, hypothetically, says something stupid, right? And will the viewer care if that person is from Stand Up Astana or not? No, they'll say, oh, they're all like that, yeah? So, of course, ideally you should work with people, but nobody has the time or the desire, so they see it as a brand.
Can we say that today you can earn money in stand up systematically rather than by chance? Or is it still a feverish market, so to speak, where you can when you can and you can't when you can't?
It depends on where you are, first of all. Yeah, it depends heavily on the city. Well, there's this expression, I rule over the chaos. That's a really great kind of expression for comedy because most comedians, they exist in a reality where these opportunities pop up, we process them, and we make some money. But there are projects within which, if you perform consistently, you earn enough money to cover your living expenses. That's if we're talking about just a performing comedian, because you see, I earn both from performing and from organizing. So with me, it's a slightly more complex story. Right, if you're moving within a project, so to speak, then most likely you can earn a living as a comedian. Yeah.
Uh huh.
So, unfortunately, this going back to your previous earlier question, unfortunately, in terms of the industry's development now in Kazakhstan, we're currently in a reality where to truly earn a stable income, as a comedian, you have to be part of some kind of project. Just freely like that, I don't know, making excuse me, I'll say it in rubles, say 100,000 rubles as a comedian. Not every comedian can do that at all. Not every comedian. So, outside of a project,
So,
there are.
there are.
There are, of course there are. But again, the media presence factor. A high profile comedian, they can do that for themselves. If we're talking about an average comedian, say an average comedian in Moscow can earn, say, 100,000 teng. In Kazakhstan, it's much harder.
In a developed entertainment industry, there are certain rules. Art tours, institutions, production models, agencies, venues, media. But when it's just starting out, you have to build a lot of it with your own hands. And that's exactly why new players always have a chance to take their place, their niche on one pedestal or another, in one market or another, regionally or globally. Yeah. And this is where the main question immediately arises. What's more difficult and interesting in Kazakhstan? The fact that the stand up industry isn't fully formed yet? Yeah. Or the fact that it can be built almost from scratch?
It depends on what kind of person you are. I mean, of course, here, for some, it's a window of opportunity, but obviously, whatever you're building, it's not easy. It takes time, patience, effort, and so on. Speaking of the upside, in my personal view, I think Kazakhstan is cool in that regard because you have a huge window of opportunity. It's not just that you're taking a certain position and so on, but basically that this field is still on a fairly high wave right now. I mean, just look at, say, America and so on. Stand up is already an outdated format there, right? People go to specific artists. And most of the artists performing in Canada, the US, and so on, they perform to almost empty rooms, hoping they'll be noticed there. A producer who, out of the goodness of his heart, will give them an 8-minute slot next time. And that's how they build their careers over several years, so that one day they can perform solo concerts there. Since we're in Kazakhstan and it's still a relatively young genre here, relatively, of course, relatively, well, the window of opportunity for everyone here is wide open.
And how difficult is it to explain the value of stand up to venues and partners? Does it ever happen that you're planning to organize something? Well, as far as I know, you also coordinate with the Akimat periodically. So, how hard is it to explain the value of a particular event? I take it it's not that easy to just say, we want to do this because, well, it'll be cool. But I think that's a bit cliche, right?
I just thought for a moment how interesting the Akamat would sound if they reacted by saying, well, that's not cool. That would be their assessment. That would be interesting, of course. No, yes, indeed. Since we're in the capital, after all, the control here is stricter. Obviously, there are laws, like laws against swearing, that you have to consider if you're working in a public place or, say, a community center and so on. According to the law in general, if you organize an event for 200 people or more, this is actually written in all contracts if you rent a venue. It's explicitly stated there that you're required to get permission from the Akimat. I think it says notify the Akalat, but the point is that you inform them that you're doing such and such to see if everything is okay. Because really, what if you decided to gather, I don't know, your own cult and were like, I'll do it in a conference hall, for example, right? So really, and considering it's the capital, it's understandable. Just because I worked in television, so I'm generally used to the system where you have to notify a government agency before doing anything. Given that we never break any rules, everything is always within the law, always without exception, then generally you just have to notify them. But it's a process. You have to send it in a certain form, answer questions, because they won't say you're doing a comedy show. They probably haven't seen it on YouTube and been like, yeah, I like it. Let's go. Well, unlikely, so you have to, but at the same time, you can't send a comedian to answer for it because a comedian, as I said before, is more about the joke, right? So you act as this link between comedy and the official body that needs to be explained that everything will be fine, everything is within the law, that it's structured like this and like that, and so on. That's if we're talking about Akimats, right? If we're talking about venues, then first of all, it's important to understand that it's a commercial story. Any venue is a commercial story, and it's important to understand how they make money. Based on that, you shouldn't talk through the lens of like, we'll create a great atmosphere for you, butterflies will be flying around, and all that. But, well, after all, it's about money. And as a result, you need to understand what the profit is for this specific venue, how you can both make money in this collaborative story. And if they see that you're, well, not a fool, excuse my language, then you'll be able to reach an agreement, and if everything goes well, you'll continue to work comfortably together. And that way, everyone will enjoy it. And overall, business in an ideal world is a story where everyone enjoys themselves and everyone makes money. So, as a result, you step in as an organizer in the sense that you have to convey the value through these narrow minded views.
It's niche.
Well, you can tell that to your wrong. I mean, for most people, well, now in 2026, no matter who you say it to, they'll say, go tell that to your niche. And they'll be right. Because your job as a businessman, an organizer, a producer, is to convey meaning. Now, if you've conveyed the meaning, then you'll be happy, the audience will be happy, and the artist will be happy.
I would call this prologue a battle of meanings.
Very accurate. A very fair point. Indeed, a battle of meanings. Because people, for example, I was talking to a venue recently, I won't name it, but here's the point. I'm bringing on Michelle. The show fits their format perfectly. The auditorium is perfect and everything else too. And they're like, we're not comfortable with this because our people are closed off and so on. And I'm like, that's not true. I mean, it's not that I'm calling you a liar, but first of all, I've performed there before. I know what your audience is like. That's one. Second, you're responding to my proposal based on the assumption that I'll hold the event, say, during this specific time period. But I know that bars, if we're talking about a bar, have three seating modes. We have pre-party events, that's roughly from 18 to, well, 8 or 9. It varies for everyone. Then the party, like from 9 or 10 until midnight or 1, and the after party later, right. For me, almost all stand up, is a pre-party event. That's the time when people usually don't go to bars. So I'm offering you an event that will bring in an audience you can keep, and later on, so to speak, for your main event, you'll have more people and make more money. And as soon as we talk through the lens of this meaning, it becomes a bit more interesting. Then we discuss other things like the numbers and all that. So it's important to understand what's needed, what we can offer, and find a compromise. That's the general scheme.
And can Astana become the center of comedy, at least in Kazakhstan, if not Central Asia, using this example, right? Or will everything continue to develop strictly in Almaty?
That's a very good question, and it's a very difficult one to answer because it's honestly like reading tea leaves. Because if we're talking about today's realities, of course, Almaty shows it still shows very great results. But on the other hand, we see how Astana's growing and developing day by day. On the other hand, I've been saying this for 5 years now, and sometimes I think that I'm like this. Like a fanatic, I have a certain position and I'm gonna stick to it. If you wake me up at night, I'll say the same thing. So, but on the other hand, really, a festival was held recently and the number of comedians is increasing. We see that the number of venues is increasing. The opportunities to earn money as a comedian are increasing. As a result, we know through the prism of business what will happen next. That next, there will be an opportunity to convert all these talents into some kind of financial story through production and so on. That is, and at this point, we will already be looking at what is more appropriate. Because what I probably like is that because comedians in Astana, go through these, well, excuse me, sufferings, I can't call it anything else, where, say, you perform for an audience member and he sits there with a stone face like this, right? And you still want to joke, you fight for every little chuckle. Every comedian who performs in Astana, he gets hardened, as if by going through this. So that's why there are fewer comedians, but each one is more like this, as if, well, quite tough. Yeah, where this'll lead next, I don't know. I'll see. But in my view, Astana will indeed become a very important milestone. A very important milestone. Where artists will really go, even now artists are going there, not only in the musical genre, but also in comedy.
Without going too far and quite seriously, Arthur,
Yes,
the cosmic conversion.
let's clarify. That's still a general question. The cost of conversion.
Well, you said, I hope that this converts. I just want to know, what is the cost of this conversion? That is it the cost of the venue? That is the organizational infrastructure? That is, more should appear. For this, so what should have an impact? Is it more places where events are held, more events in general? That is essentially what can start it, and what is the consequence? So, this is what I mean here.
I'm sure it's more events because comedians grow through events. And in order for us to have this kind of production and so on in Astana now, we need specific comedians.
Huh.
A certain number of them who will create a certain amount of content. It's not that the comedians are bad and so on, there's just not enough, considering how many are needed. That is, for example, I once worked with Channel 7 for we recorded a Kazakh concert for them, a Kazakh stand-up. And at that point, it became clear that, well, there's just not enough opportunity for the guys who joke in Kazakh. Very funny guys, really great. I mean, they just lack the space, the number of performances needed to work on their material. Because what's the deal with stand up? It's not like you just go out and tell a joke and it's instantly amazing. It's a systematic, long, tedious process where you gradually pick out meanings and jokes to build a perfect, funny picture that someone like, say, Tatiana from the cafeteria, whom we mentioned before, will see for the first time and think, he's super funny. She doesn't know that the person who told that joke has been working on it for, say, 6 months, right? So, for such comedians to emerge, you need venues and a high volume of performances.
But is there an audience large enough to fill those venues? That's the thing.
I agree with that. It's certainly difficult on one hand. But on the other hand, right? Now there are more organizers working in the city than there were 2 years ago. Twice as many. That says a lot.
Today, we started with a simple question: how is stand up organized in Kazakhstan? But through it, we reached a broader topic: how the creative industry is built in the region in general. From the outside, stand up looks simple. A person goes on stage, the audience laughs, and the night is a success. But if you look from the inside, there's much more behind it: organization, venues, sales, audience trust, working with comedians, media, reputation, and a constant understanding of why someone buys the ticket at all. I think this is an important conversation specifically for Central Asia, because business here is often associated with more traditional sectors: trade, construction, manufacturing, raw materials, and finance. But the modern economy increasingly shows that a sustainable business can also be built around attention, live experiences, events, community, and entertainment. Stand up is one such example. Through it, we can see how a young industry gradually gathers its audience, its formats, its rules, and its own economy. Thank you for showing us this side of the stage, Artur.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the xChief Central Asia podcast. With us was Arthur Afonso Dushalash, stand-up comedian, producer, comedy event organizer, and founder of the Comedy Point community. Subscribe to the channel, watch the full episode, and let us know in the comments, do you think entertainment in Kazakhstan and Central Asia can become a full-fledged industry, or is it still just driven by individuals and enthusiasts? See you in the next episode.